So it started out like every other day. He woke up, rolled over, opened his eyes. Nothing. Total darkness. No difference whether his eyes were open or closed. I don't know about you, but I would probably be panicking about this point. But he'd never known anything else. He was born this way. He somehow made his way to the spot he normally sat in to beg, probably somewhere on the temple grounds. Just another day of survival and darkness. But Jesus was there that day, the light of the world. The beggar heard some men talking about him, and then one of them walked up to him and knelt down. Somehow he knew it was Jesus. And although he couldn't see him, his blindness had made his other senses sharper. And suddenly he heard Jesus go spit on the ground. And then he heard him playing in the dirt. The man told him to shut his eyes. Then he smeared mud on his eyelids. Then told him to go wash his eyes off at the pool of Siloam, some 600 or 700 meters away from the temple grounds down a steep hill. And that is the setting for one of Jesus' strangest miracles. The Apostle John has kind of organized the gospel around 7 major miracles or signs, and this is number 6 as we work through the gospel. And the miracle and its aftermath are recorded in John chapter 9. I invite you to turn there. And we're going to work through the passage, and I want to explore 6 lessons that we can learn from it. John chapter 9. As he went along, that is Jesus, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus, "but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." So we're not given a specific time frame for this event, but at some point, Jesus and his disciples are walking along and they see this blind man. And John tells us that he's been blind from birth. This, incidentally, is the first time the disciples are mentioned since the beginning of chapter 7. And the disciples ask Jesus, who sinned for this man to be born blind? Did he? Some rabbis were teaching that it is possible to sin before birth. Or was it his parents' fault? Now picture the scene. Here's this poor man, blind from birth, reduced to begging for his survival. And what they see is a theological conundrum. How often do we look at human suffering and view it from a political or a strategic or a theological perspective rather than actually seeing the hurt and pain that people are going through? Well, Jesus explained that his blindness wasn't a result of sin, but was so that God's work could be displayed in him. And he also reminds them that they are on a timeline and once again claims to be the light of the world. This brings us really to the first lesson from the passage, and that is hard times are not necessarily our fault, punishment for sin, or consequences of bad decisions. Now, it can be any or all of those things. That's why the word necessarily is in there. The disciples thought that if bad things happen, it must be because someone had done something wrong. I suspect that most of us struggle with that. When we're going through hard times, we wonder what we did to deserve this. And it's interesting that Job's three friends in the Old Testament, in the book of Job, and Job himself believed this idea that bad things are a result of sin. His friends assumed that Job had committed some bad sin to experience what he was going through, and they pressed him to admit it and own it. And the more he denied it, the more specific and great his sin became in their eyes. Job also felt that bad things happen as a result of sin, and he wanted a hearing with God so he could argue his innocence. And this idea just seems logical to us. We're kind of hooked on karma. This idea that things that happen to us are a consequence. But Jesus said this man wasn't blind because of anyone's sin. He was blind for this exact encounter. Now, my thoughts when I was reading through this is, being blind isn't easy. How old was this guy? How many years did he have to be blind for this day? He's been blind all of his life in order to be an example of God's power at work? Then I thought, well, there were an awful lot of other disabled adults around during that time that weren't healed at this point. But I wonder if we could have asked that man later in the day if being blind all those years was worth it to meet Jesus. I wonder what he would say. One of the times I read this chapter over the years, I wrote this note in my Bible app. Sometimes bad things happen to display God's power and grace. Am I willing to accept whatever comes in order to be an example of His work? I hope so. I hope I would be willing to do that. The story continues. After saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" Some claimed that he was. Others said, "No, he only looks like him." But he himself insisted, "I am the man." Now, this was a strange miracle. Usually, Jesus just touched people or just said the word, and they were healed. For some reason, Jesus didn't do that here. And there's a lot of speculation about why he did it this way. One of the commentaries I read said, what Jesus did next was rather shocking. The story, as stated, simply bristles with symbolic allusions which are subject to varied scholarly opinions with respect to their meanings. That's an intellectual way of saying a lot of people wonder why he did it this way. But John leaves it a mystery. He doesn't explain. Jesus spit on the ground and used his saliva to mix up some mud, which he smeared on the man's eyes. Then he told him to go to the pool of Siloam and wash it off. And when he did, he was healed. A few more lessons from this. The second lesson we learn from this is that nothing is too hard for Jesus. Whatever you're going through in your life right now is not too hard for Jesus. Healing a man who was born blind is a hard thing. John wants to emphasize this. He mentions 13 times in this chapter that the man was blind. 5 of those, he specifies that he was born blind. And he uses the word for blind at least 15 times in the chapter, more than any other chapter in the New Testament and more than in many of the New Testament books. Now, I learned some interesting things from my study of this passage. One is that there are no references in the Old Testament of a person being healed of blindness. And there's only one reference outside of the Gospels of someone healed from blindness, and that's when Saul of Tarsus met Jesus and was temporarily blinded, and Ananias came and prayed for him. Healing the blind was believed to be one of the signs of the Messiah. One of the commentaries wrote, "But when we examine the ministry of Jesus, there are more instances of the healing of blind people than any other type of miracle." And he lists 7 passages that talk about Jesus healing blind people in the Gospels. So whatever you are going through in your life right now, it's not too hard for Jesus. A third thing we can learn from this is that Jesus doesn't always do what we would expect. As I said, this was an unusual miracle. Jesus usually would just heal people with a word or a touch. This time he not only healed him with mud made from his saliva, but he made him go somewhere to wash it off. Fun fact, the Gospels record 3 times when Jesus healed someone with his saliva. That sounds kind of gross to us, but it worked every time. This was one of the things actually that got Jesus in trouble. He not only healed the man on the Sabbath, but he mixed clay, which was considered work, and so that got him into all kinds of trouble. So he cakes the mud on the man's eyes and told him to go to the pool of Siloam to wash it off. Now, when Hezekiah was king about 700 years before this, Jerusalem was under threat of attack by the Assyrians. And so Hezekiah had a tunnel carved through the solid rock from outside at the spring of Gihon, which was their major source of water for the city of Jerusalem, but it was outside the walls so that they could channel that water into the city. The tunnel was about 700 feet, a little over 700 feet long, and interesting, they started from both ends. Now, I heard that that's what they're going to do with our new tunnel up here, and I thought, that's really a tricky thing to do, to start at both ends, because you really got to be exact to get it together. This was 700 years before Jesus. This was almost 3,000 years ago. So that's pretty incredible technology. But several pools were built inside the city walls to store the water so that if they were under siege, they would not run out of water. And the pool of Siloam was one of them. And like I said, it was about 600 or 700 meters from the Temple Mount down a steep hill. Now, the man is blind. Imagine if I blindfolded you and said, need you to walk down to Starbucks to take the blindfold off. Just that having to walk that without being able to see what you're doing. But he does it. He did it, and he was healed. Which brings us to the 4th lesson from here. Jesus calls us to faith and obedience. As I said, John doesn't tell us why Jesus made him go down to the pool and wash the mud off, but I suspect that it was to see just how serious he was about being healed. This called for an act of faith on the beggar's part. He'd never seen Jesus. He may have heard him say that he was the light of the world. But someone comes up, packs mud on your eyes, and tells you to go more than a half a kilometer to wash it off. To do that, he has to leave the place where he's been begging, and there's no guarantee that this is going to work. But he steps out in faith, and he obeys Jesus, and is healed. That immediately creates a buzz, as you can imagine. People who know him are shocked that he's able to see. Is this really the guy that we know, or is this someone who just looks like him? And he assures him that he's the guy. How then were your eyes opened? They asked. He replied, the man they call Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see. Where is this man? They asked him. I don't know, he said. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. He put mud on my eyes, the man replied, and I washed, and now I see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. Talk about missing the point. But others asked, how can a sinner perform such signs? So they were divided. So they bring the man to the Pharisees who want to know what happened, and he tells them what Jesus did, and their immediate reaction is, well, he can't be from God because he did this on the Sabbath. But at least others don't see how he could perform such signs if he was a sinner and not from God. And so I love that line at the very end. So they were divided. I think if there was a phrase that characterized 21st century North America, it might be that one. So they were divided. Then they turned again to the blind man. What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened. The man replied, he's a prophet. They still did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. Is this your son? They asked. Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that now he can see? We know he is our son, the parents answered, and we know he was born blind. But how he can see now or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He's of age. He will speak for himself. So maybe the Pharisees can prove that this wasn't actually a miracle after all, that it was a fake. So they ask his parents. They confirm that he's their son. He was born blind. They say, look, if you need any more details, talk to him. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders who already had decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. That was why his parents said, he's of age, ask him. A second time they summoned the man who had been blind. Give glory to God by telling the truth, they said. We know this man is a sinner. He replied, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. This brings us to the fifth lesson from this passage, and that is there is power in our story. There was a lot about Jesus this man didn't know. When the people asked him where Jesus was, he said, I don't know. Later on, he says to the Pharisees, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. And when Jesus hears that he gets kicked out, and I gave the story away. Jesus later, when he comes up to him and asked him if he believes in the Son of Man, he says, who is he? Who is he? Tell me so I can believe in him. There's a lot he didn't know about Jesus. But he had never had a day like this. It started out just like any other day, and suddenly he's healed and being interrogated by the Pharisees. There was a lot he didn't know, but here's what he did know. Once I was blind, now I can see. How do you argue with that? When he got up this morning, he was blind. Now he can see. They may argue with his beliefs, and they do. They may question the reality of his experience, and they do. But at the end of the day, once he was blind, now he can see. Never underestimate the power of your story. You don't have to have all the answers. People may disagree with your beliefs, but if you've had a genuine encounter with Jesus, you have a story to tell. Let's continue. Then they asked him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" This is a great interrogation tactic, right? Keep asking them the same question. See if they give you the same answer. He answered, "I've told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too?" His confidence is building. Then they hurled insults at him and said, "You are this fellow's disciple. We're disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from." The man answered, "Now that's remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." To this they replied, "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And they threw him out. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out, and when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" "Who is he, sir?" the man asked. "Tell me so that I may believe in him." Jesus said, "You have now seen him. In fact, he's the one speaking with you." Then the man said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshiped him. So Jesus hears that he got excommunicated, and he went looking for him. And now he meets Jesus face to face. He doesn't even realize it at first. But when Jesus reveals himself to him, he saw, he believed, and he worshiped. This day changed his life in more ways than one. He can see, and he is a follower of Jesus. Jesus said, "For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind." Some Pharisees who were with him heard him say this and asked, "What? Are we blind too?" Jesus said, "If you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin, but now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains." And that's where this story ends. Which brings us to our sixth lesson. There's more than one kind of blindness. There's physical blindness, which has a tremendous impact on this life. But there's also spiritual blindness that not only impacts this life, but our eternity. Which kind of blindness should we be most concerned about? Some people won't believe in Jesus no matter how compelling the evidence. The Pharisees saw the man who was healed. They had heard Jesus teach. They had seen him minister, but they were blind. So caught up in their religious system that they couldn't recognize the very Messiah that they have been teaching about, looking for, and praying for. Have you ever met anyone like that? Are you like that? The blind man opens our eyes to some things about Jesus, about our circumstances, about faith and commitment, and about the power of our faith story. One thing I know, I was blind, but now I see. Lord, thank you for telling us this story. Help us to learn what you want us to learn from it. For in your name we pray. Amen.